He is waist-deep in brown, stinking water heart, beating so hard he can feel it in his teeth. 11 Japanese snipers have already died because of his rifle, and now 6 more men are closing in following his muddy boot prints straight to the hole where he's hiding. If they find him, he won't be captured. He'll be cut to pieces and left for the jungle. He raises the Winchester water dripping from the barrel, and when he locks eyes with the first soldier at the rim of the crater, there is no time left for fear or prayer or second thoughts. Only the cold decision to shoot first and live one more minute. If you're watching this on WW2 Secrets, do something for the man in that crater. Hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're hearing this story from. Is this the first time John George's name has ever reached you? Or did someone in your family whisper about men like him long ago before the world ever knew his name? Before 11 snipers fell beneath the crack of a deer hunter's rifle, in a jungle half a world from home. John George was simply a quiet Midwestern kid with a gift, one dangerous, lonely talent that war would someday demand of him. But in late 1942, as Guadalcanal's sky boiled with humidity, and the jungle swallowed whole regiments, that gift earned him nothing except laughter. They called his Winchester Model 70 a toy, a mail-order sweetheart, a hunting rifle with no place in a real war. Officers smirked when they saw the Lyman Alaskan scope, a civilian optic, and joked that maybe he planned to shoot rabbits for the mess hall. To them, George was just another young lieutenant, 27 years old, polite, thin, carrying a rifle bought with 2 years of National Guard pay. A sentimental purchase for a sentimental man. But the ground around Point Cruz had no space for sentiment. 11 Japanese snipers operated among the towering banyan trees there. In just 72 hours, 14 Americans from the 132nd Infantry had been killed with a precision that froze entire platoons in place. Men stopped talking above a whisper. Others refused to lift their heads. Patrols returned, shaken, cursing ghosts in the trees. The Marines before them had fought since August. They had taken Henderson Field, held it through hellish nights of naval shelling and human wave attacks, but they had not cleared the western groves. Those groves were a labyrinth of roots, thicker than a man's torso, branches high enough to hide an entire squad's shadows, so deep that even sunlight looked murderous. Into that maze stepped George, armed not with the standard-issue Garand, but with his unfashionable bolt-action rifle that no one wanted him to carry. When the Winchester finally arrived at Guadalcanal 6 weeks late, packed in cosmoline and dust, George cradled the wooden crate like it was alive. He opened it with the care of a jeweler revealing a ruby. 9 pounds of blued steel and walnut, topped with a scope barely stronger than a pair of cheap binoculars. But George knew what that rifle could do. He had already proved it years before the war, shooting 6-inch groups at 600 yards, winning the Illinois State Championship at only 23, the youngest in state history. None of that mattered now. What mattered was, these men were dying. And they were dying because whoever held those Arisaka rifles in the treetops knew the jungle better than any American alive. On January 19th, Corporal Davis was shot while filling his canteen at a creek. The next day, 2 more men fell on patrol. On the 21st, 3 died, one with a bullet straight through the neck from a tree the squad had walked past twice. Fear spread like rot. Even seasoned Marines whispered that the spirits of the island were hunting them. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The air outside the command tent was thick with rain and the sour smell of uniforms, soaked with sweat. Inside, lantern light flickered across maps, pinned with desperation. The commander stared at George for a long moment before speaking, not with ridicule, but with something far heavier. "The snipers are killing my men faster than malaria," he said. "I need someone who can shoot." He pointed at the rifle slung over George's shoulder. "That thing." "Can it actually hit anything?" George explained calmly, almost shyly. His record, his years at Camp Perry, the groups he could hold at 300 yards even with iron sights. He didn't brag. He simply stated facts the way a carpenter would describe a level board. The commander listened, then nodded once. "You'll prove it in the morning. Outside, Thunder rolled across the island like distant artillery. Back in his tent, George cleaned the Winchester for the second time that night. Cosmoline clung to every groove. Mud from the damp Guadalcanal air smeared across the bolt. He stripped the rifle down, checked the mounts, and loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition he had carried all the way from Tennessee. Raw civilian, never meant for war, and yet here it was about to decide the fate of men who had mocked him hours earlier. He lay awake with the rifle across his lap, the weight of the wood and steel strangely comforting against the chaos outside. Tomorrow, he would walk into a jungle where eyes hid in the treetops, and death came from branches that didn't move. And at exactly 9:17 a.m., history would stop laughing at him. Dawn on Guadalcanal is not gentle. It does not bloom across the horizon or soften the world with color. It arrives like a blade, sudden sharp, slicing away the darkness and exposing every secret the jungle tried to hide during the night. By the time John George crawled into the shattered Japanese bunker overlooking the coconut groves west of Point Cruz, the air was already wet enough to feel like a second skin. He carried nothing but his Winchester, a canteen, and 60 rounds in stripper clips. No spotter, no radio, no one watching his back. Just a lone marksman stepping into a place where 11 Japanese sharpshooters had turned the treetops into killing grounds. The bunker still smelled of the men who once defended it, oil cordite sweat dirt. Jagged concrete walls were pocked by shrapnel. A rusted Type 96 machine gun mount protruded like an exposed bone. George ignored the ghosts around him and laid his rifle across a mound of dirt, adjusting the scope until the world narrowed into a circular window of green shadows and distant branches. The banyan trees dominated the landscape, monsters rising 90 feet into the sky, their roots twisting like limbs of something alive, something ancient. A sniper could disappear inside one for an entire day. Some trunks were so wide that even a mortar shell would have struggled to split them. But the jungle had taught George something already. The forest never truly stops moving unless someone is trying not to move at all. The Lyman Alaskan scope was only 2.5x magnification, not enough to bring the world closer, only enough to sharpen its edges. Still, it was better than nothing. He breathed evenly, letting the noise of insects and distant artillery fade until his awareness shrank to nothing but slow, deliberate sweeps from left to right, top to bottom, across each massive tree. Minutes passed. The sun crawled higher. Sweat dripped down his temples, gathered at his collar, slid down his spine. He blinked once, maybe twice. Then, at 9:17, the world shifted. A branch moved just slightly, just enough to break the rhythm of the canopy. No wind, no birds landing, just a flicker where nothing should have flickered. George froze. His pulse steadied. His breathing slowed into a practiced cadence. He drifted the crosshairs upward, climbing the trunk of the banyan 240 yards away. There, a shape half swallowed by shadow, dark clothing blending into dark bark. A man crouched in the fork of 3 branches facing east, watching the trail where American supply lines threaded through the jungle like exposed nerves. George adjusted the elevation. 2 clicks right. The trigger felt like glass beneath his finger, clean, crisp, made for precision, not panic. He exhaled, pressed. The Winchester barked a single, sharp report, swallowed by the heavy air. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked once, then fell. Branches snapped. His body tumbled through 90 feet of empty space before crashing against the roots below. George didn't relish it. He didn't flinch either. He simply worked the bolt's smooth fluid and scanned for movement. Snipers rarely hunted alone. The dead man's spotter had to be close. For a long moment, everything was still. Then, at 9:43, he found the second one 60 yards north, clinging halfway down a trunk, retreating after hearing the shot. This one moved fast, climbing down like a shadow fleeing the light. George led him slightly, predicted the angle, and squeezed. The body fell backward, the rifle clattering through the branches like a skeleton of metal and wood. 2 shots, 2 kills. The jungle did not celebrate. It did not even acknowledge what had happened. But somewhere behind the American lines, word spread with the speed of wildfire. Men who once mocked George's mail-order sweetheart were suddenly whispering about a lieutenant who could hit ghosts in trees. Still, the morning had one final lesson to give. At 11:21, a bullet hissed out of the tree line and slammed into a sandbag 6 inches from George's skull, throwing dirt into his eyes. He rolled aside, pressing himself tight against the broken wall. This shooter wasn't fleeing. He wasn't panicking. He was hunting back. When George finally located him, third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up, the sniper had shifted branches, but stayed in the same tree. A mistake. George fired. The body fell silently, swallowed whole by the jungle floor. 5 kills by noon. The men who laughed at him would not laugh again. The second day did not begin with sunlight. It began with rain, the kind that falls in thick, violent sheets, and turns the jungle into a drowning world. By dawn on January 23rd, the groves of Point Cruz were nothing but moving curtains of water. Visibility collapsed to 100 yards, then 80, then barely 50. Trees blurred into gray silhouettes. The earth became a swamp of mud and rotting leaves. But for men like George and the snipers hunting him, the rain was not an inconvenience. It was strategy. Japanese snipers often climbed before sunrise, moving silently behind the roar of the storm. Rain masked the sound of hands on bark boots, sliding over roots, metal clinking against wood. If you were clever, if you understood patience, the storm became a shield. And George knew this. He sat in the shattered bunker water, creeping under his boots, rifle resting across soaked sandbags. He waited not with frustration, but with the cold patience of a man who now understood what the day would become, a duel in the rain. At 08:15, the downpour eased. By 08:45, visibility returned just enough for killing. George scanned the tree line. His breath formed small clouds in the morning chill. The scope glass trembled faintly from distant thunder. Then, at 09:12, he found the day's first sniper, high in a banyan nearly 290 yards away, farther than yesterday. A longer shot, a riskier shot. Someone was adapting. The Japanese soldier had climbed during the storm, tucked into a perfect corner of branches. If he hadn't shifted his weight at that exact moment, George might never have seen him. But he did. Wind, distance, elevation. The math felt instinctive, almost mechanical. He squeezed the trigger. The figure slumped sideways and vanished behind the trunk, 6 down. But this time the response was immediate, and it was violent. At 09:57, mortars began to fall. The first salvo landed 40 yards short, sending mud and shards of root skyward. The second came 20 yards short, showering George with wet soil and splintered bark. The third would be on target. George didn't think. He ran. He bolted from the bunker boots, sinking in mud, rifle hugged tight to his chest. He sprinted north along the tree-lined lungs burning in the humid air and dove headfirst into a shell crater as the world behind him exploded. The bunker he had occupied seconds earlier ceased to exist, reduced to smoking rubble and shattered concrete. The Japanese had triangulated his firing position, something only the most disciplined units could pull off in dense jungle. It meant one thing: they were no longer just defending. They were hunting him. He crawled out of the crater body, trembling from adrenaline, and pushed deeper into the grove until he found cover beneath a fallen tree, a massive trunk torn down by an artillery strike weeks earlier. It offered a stable firing rest and a clean view of the groves. He settled in, adjusted, waited. The afternoon stretched with unbearable tension. The Japanese had changed tactics. No more sudden movement, no more hasty repositioning. They stayed still, letting the forest conceal them. This was no longer about accuracy, it was about endurance. But George had reserves of patience few men possessed. At 14:23, he found the 7th sniper. A glint, just a fraction of light reflecting off a scope lens. One shot. Another body tumbling through branches. At 15:41, the 8th. This one had climbed high, 94 feet up. A brilliant hide, nearly invisible. But height is a double-edged sword at certain sun angles. It turns a man into a silhouette. George caught that fleeting shadow and ended it with a single shot. By late afternoon, the forest fell silent again, eerily so. Even birds seemed to sense the unnatural hush settling over the groves. At 1700, a runner came to pull him back to headquarters. Captain Morris didn't smirk this time. He didn't jab at the rifle. He simply asked, "How many 8 confirmed?" George answered the words calm, but edged with exhaustion. 12 rounds fired, 4 misses. The captain nodded and told him to prepare for dawn. Back in his tent, George cleaned his Winchester, each stroke slow and methodical. Rain hammered against the canvas roof as twilight drowned the island. 11 enemy snipers had stalked those groves at the start. 8 were now dead. The last 3 would be the hardest. They were not just survivors. They were hunters who had watched their comrades fall one by one and learned. George loaded 5 fresh rounds. Tomorrow would not be a test. It would be a reckoning. Night on Guadalcanal is never peaceful, only quieter between the terrors. The rain came again heavier this time, pounding George's tent like 1,000 fingertips, drumming impatience. Men were trying to sleep around him, but the jungle was awake, shifting and breathing like a living animal. Every gust of wind rattled branches. Every creak sounded like footsteps. Every distant crack could have been a rifle or a tree splitting under its own weight. George sat on his cot with the Winchester across his lap, running a cloth down the barrel for the 3rd time. Not because it needed it, but because he needed it. Ritual steadied him. Precision calmed him. Outside, someone coughed, a deep, hacking sound of a man who had been fighting mold, rain, fear, and jungle rot for too long. 8 snipers, dead out of 11. 3 remained. Only 3, but the difference between 3 and none was measured in American lives. These weren't rookies anymore. These were the survivors, the men who learned from each corpse that hit the dirt, who listened to the crack of the Winchester and moved differently because of it. Men who had watched the pattern, studied the angles, taken note of the timing. And now they knew him. They knew his rifle. They knew his likely positions. They knew his breathing had taken 8 brothers from the trees. George could feel their eyes in the dark, waiting. He lay back on his cot, but sleep refused him. His mind replayed this day in fragments, the shattering blast of the mortars, the way mud sprayed across his face, the sudden emptiness where the bunker had been. He pictured the 7th sniper's lens flare, the 8th man's silhouette, the bodies dropping through layers of leaves like heavy birds with broken wings. Some soldiers prayed before battle, others cursed. George simply remembered. He remembered Camp Perry, the smell of cut grass, the metallic tang of spent cartridges, the instructors who watched him shoot from 600 yards with a calm that unnerved even seasoned competitors. He remembered holding his breath until the world narrowed to a thin silver line at the end of the barrel. He remembered his father saying, "Skill is a burden if you're the only one who has it." Tonight, that burden pressed down on him like a mountaintop. He stood and stepped outside. The rain washed over him, cold and relentless. The encampment was dim, lit only by tent lanterns and the faint glow of smoldering cooking fires. Men huddled under ponchos or sat staring into the mud, haunted by the invisible eyes in the trees that had taken so many of their friends. George walked toward the tree line, stopped short of the shadows, and listened. Nothing but rain. But he imagined the snipers out there, crouched in roots and branches, skin slick with humidity, fingers resting lightly on their triggers. Somewhere one of them was likely awake, thinking of him. He returned to his tent at 3 a.m. He cleaned the rifle one more time. At 4:15, the rain shifted from heavy to torrential, an omen, or perhaps an opportunity. And by 05:30, he made his decision. The Japanese expected him to return to the bunker or the fallen tree. They expected rhythm, pattern, predictability. So he changed everything. He moved south, 70 yards away from any position he had used before, to a cluster of massive rocks that Marines had once turned into a machine gun nest. Now abandoned, They offered something precious: height, cover, overlapping fields of fire into the groves. Most importantly, unpredictability. George crawled into position with the ease of a man slipping into cold water, slow, careful, letting the earth swallow him whole. The rain thinned to a mist. The jungle exhaled. The light crawled back into the world inch by inch. He rested the Winchester on a stone ledge, wiped the moisture from his scope, and started the methodical devotional act that had already saved dozens of lives. One tree at a time. One breath at a time. One movement at a time. He did not know that today would bring bait, false shadows, hidden pairs, and death stalking him from the ground instead of the branches. He only knew that the next 3 snipers were waiting, and he was going to find them first. At 07:43 on January 24th, the rain faded into a thin drizzle, the kind that clung to skin and metal like a warning. The rocks beneath George were slick, but the elevation gave him a vantage point no one American or Japanese had used before. From here, he could look down into the groves instead of staring upward into a maze of branches. It was the kind of angle that cracked open illusions. By 08:17, that angle saved his life. He caught the shape first, as a dark smear inside a fan of palm fronds, only 40 feet up too low for a sniper with discipline. That immediately bothered him. Japanese marksmen preferred height for a reason. Elevation meant patience, concealment, control. But this one perched in a palm barely taller than a house in direct sightline of elevated ground. Too careless, too exposed, too obvious. George lifted the Winchester, aligned the crosshairs on the dark shape between the fronds, and froze. No, it was wrong. This wasn't a shot, it was an invitation. 3 days of fighting had taught him how the enemy thought. The last 3 snipers weren't amateurs. They were the survivors, the men who learned from every fallen comrade. A palm tree offering a perfect target wasn't a mistake, it was a trap. A lure designed to bait the American who had been killing them one by one. George lowered the rifle slowly, heartbeat steady, senses prying open every shadow within 300 yards. If that was the bait, where was the hook? He swept the banyans around the palm, slow, patient strokes. Down one trunk, up another. Across a network of branches woven so tight, the sky barely existed between them. Minutes passed. At 08:28, there it was. 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up, was the real sniper, silent, pressed into a cradle of vines and branches so expertly that even the color of his uniform blended into the bark. A near-perfect hide, invisible from ground level. But George wasn't at ground level, not today. The Japanese marksman was staring at the fallen tree where George had been the previous day. He was waiting for a muzzle flash from that direction, waiting for the American to take the bait. It was a duel of wits, and one side didn't yet know the game had already been lost. George faced 2 immediate problems. 1. If he fired at the real sniper first, the sound would reveal his true position. 2. If he hesitated, the real sniper might wonder why the bait hadn't drawn fire and begin scanning for the angle George currently occupied. So George chose the only solution. Use the enemy's own trap against them. He lifted the Winchester toward the decoy, in the palm, centered the shot and fired. The palm sniper crumpled instantly, falling through fronds in a shudder of broken leaves. A believable kill. A predictable kill. And right on cue, the real sniper shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. Turning his head toward the new sound. Just as George predicted. George swung the Winchester, breath held, and fired before the man had fully turned. The body fell like a stone from 91 feet, rifle tumbling after him through a rain of vines and shattered twigs. 2 shots. 2 kills. A trap reversed. But the jungle gives nothing for free. The second shot echoed across the groves, louder from the rocks than from any ground-level hide. It carried far too far. The Japanese listening posts heard it, and so did the men who had been tracking patterns, distances, directions. At 08:34, machine gun fire erupted from the southern tree line, ripping across the rocks with brutal precision. The rounds smashed stone into dust, spat shards into George's cheek, tore through the space he'd abandoned seconds earlier. If he had stayed 2 breaths longer, he would have died where he lay. He slid off the rock shelf, dropped into a drainage ditch, and pressed himself into the mud, barely daring to breathe. The machine gun kept raking his former position, 16 seconds of uninterrupted fury. Then silence. George waited, counted to 60, then crawled out, soaked and shaking. He pushed eastward, low to the ground, sliding into a half-flooded crater with water rising to his ribs. He rested the Winchester on the muddy rim. 10 snipers were dead. 1 remained, the best of them all. And somewhere in the dripping web of banyans and palms, the final hunter was already adjusting his approach. For the first time since the battle began, George felt it not fear, but the unmistakable sense of being outthought, outwatched, even outhunted. The crater was half filled with rainwater, murky and cold, rising to George's chest as he sank deeper into it. The surface rippled with every breath he tried to quiet. Mud clung to his uniform, seeping into the fabric, chilling him, until his bones felt carved from stone. Above him, the sky was a blur of gray, through the narrow opening of the pit, a frame too small to show anything except the shapes that might come to kill him. Only one sniper remained, the most patient, the most disciplined, the one who had watched 10 men die and learned exactly what kind of predator hunted him. George steadied the Winchester on the edge of the crater, the barrel glistening with droplets. His breathing slowed until even the jungle's pulse seemed louder than his own heartbeat. He scanned the tree line through the thin circle of the scope, searching the branches for the slightest unnatural shape. Shadows, lumps, angles, anything that didn't belong. But the trees were empty. Too empty. At 09:47, something shifted in George's periphery, not above, but below. A faint ripple in a patch of ferns, 60 yards south. Low to the ground, sliding, not stepping. George blinked once. Then it hit him. The last sniper wasn't in the trees. He was crawling. Using the undergrowth as his cover, studying the rocks, where George had been inching toward George's last known location with the kind of deliberate slowness only the deadliest marksmen possess. Every movement was a calculation. Every pause, a test of silence. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. And it meant the hunter had finally become the hunted. George stayed submerged, only his eyes and the top of his helmet breaking the surface of the water. The Winchester remained pointed skyward, to keep the barrel dry, a habit learned through thousands of hours, and one that might save him now. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 09:52. He lay perfectly still 40 yards from the rocks, watching for the slightest flicker of movement, waiting, listening, predicting. The rainwater around George vibrated faintly, with each distant burst of gunfire, from other sectors of the island, but nothing else. The world narrowed into a single, suffocating stalemate, patience against patience, stillness against stillness. At 09:58, the sniper began crawling again. 35 yards, 30, 25. He was moving along the same escape path George used earlier to flee the machine gun fire. He had understood the pattern instantly. A man escaping under fire moves east. So he hunted east. George's heart tightened. This wasn't just skill. This was intuition. This was a mind shaped by countless hours in trees and mud, trained to interpret movement like a second language. This was an opponent worthy of respect. At 10:03, the sniper reached the abandoned machine gun nest, the rocks George had vacated earlier. The Japanese soldier slid into the position, silently, rifle angled toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. He was now 38 yards from George. His back was fully exposed. A clean shot. Almost effortless. George didn't take it. Something was wrong. A sniper, this experienced, would never sit still in such an exposed spot. He would never turn his back for that long. This smelled of deception, of bait, like the palm tree earlier. George tightened his grip on the rifle. His instincts screamed at him to wait. He expanded his peripheral search, scanning the ground, the fallen logs, the scattered debris around the rocks. At 10:06, he found it. Another soldier, 70 yards northwest, hidden behind a fallen tree trunk, rifle pointed toward the ditch, toward where George was expected to appear. Two hunters, working together. The final two snipers, or a sniper, and his supporting rifleman, it didn't matter. Together, they were lethal. George's bolt-action rifle couldn't kill both fast enough if he exposed himself. The moment he fired at one, the other would fire at him. The math simply didn't work. So George did the only thing left. He became invisible. He slid lower into the water slowly enough not to make a sound. Mud filled his sleeves. Water soaked the Winchester strap. Only his eyes remained above the surface, staring through a thin film that blurred the outline of the world. He waited. Minutes passed like hours. Then, at 10:13, the soldier in the rock stood up. He made a short hand signal to his partner. Both men began a coordinated sweep east, moving in parallel, scanning the jungle for any trace of George. They passed the crater. And for the first time in this battle, George had the advantage. He rose from the water like a ghost, dripping with mud, brought the Winchester up in one fluid motion, and fired at the closer man. A single shot, a thud, a body collapsing. He worked the bolt instantly, water and mud flying from the handle, turned to the second man who was just beginning to raise his rifle, and fired first. The man folded behind the fallen tree, silence, broken only by George's own breath, harsh, shaking, but alive. 11 snipers, 3 days, 11 shots for 11 men. He had finally cleared the groves. But he had no time to savor it. Somewhere beyond the trees, voices were approaching, the heavy footfalls of soldiers. Multiple men, not snipers this time. They were coming for the fallen, and they were coming fast. The jungle changed when infantry moved through it. Snipers were ghosts, silent, patient, almost part of the terrain. But infantry, they were noise and urgency and weight. Their boots crushed roots. Their gear rattled. Their voices carried. You could feel them before you ever saw them. And George felt them now. He had barely stepped out of the water-filled crater when he heard shouting, sharp, clipped Japanese commands rising and falling in the humid air. Branches cracked. Metal clanged. There were too many voices for a sniper team. Too coordinated for stragglers. Too close for comfort. They had found the bodies. He slid back into the crater, immediately letting the cold, muddy water swallow him again. Only his eyes stayed above the surface. He held the Winchester upright, keeping the muzzle clear, even as his arms trembled from hours of holding the same position. The water stank of rot, of algae, of things that had died long before he fired his first shot. The voices grew louder. 6 men, maybe 7. Close enough that George could hear their breathing between the words he didn't understand. They reached the first body, the decoy sniper he had dropped at 42 yards. The soldiers spoke hurriedly, urgently. Gear shifted. Someone knelt. Someone else cursed softly. Then they moved to the second body, voices breaking with the panic of men who realized they'd been ambushed by an unseen marksman. Then, everything stopped. Every voice, every footstep, every rustle of cloth. A silence so complete it felt predatory. George froze. They had found the tracks, his tracks, boot prints in the mud that led straight to the crater. He'd been meticulous with his movement, silent, careful, expert. But he hadn't been perfect. And perfection was the only currency that kept a sniper alive in a jungle like this. At 10:28, the soldiers began moving toward him, step by step, yard by yard, 30 yards, 25, 20. At 10:31, a helmet appeared above the crater rim. A Japanese soldier leaned forward, eyes widening as he stared down directly at George, half submerged in mud, rifle raised, face streaked with rain, and fear and resolve. Their eyes locked. George fired from the water. The rifle's crack detonated inside the small pit, the recoil exploding through his soaked shoulder. The soldier jolted backward, disappearing from sight. George slammed the bolt back, water spraying from the action, chambered another round. 2 more shapes appeared over the rim. He fired again. One fell instantly. Worked the bolt, fired a third time. The second collapsed into the mud, sliding down the rim like a broken doll. 3 shots. 3 bodies. But more shouting followed closer, now rushing toward the crater from multiple directions. George didn't think. He moved. He climbed out the north side of the crater, using the rising earth to shield him from the incoming rifle fire. He sprinted 20 yards, slid behind a fallen log as bullets snapped through leaves and chewed the ground around where he'd just been. Dirt exploded inches from his cheek. Bark splintered and peppered his arms. He pressed the scope to his eye. 2 soldiers were advancing toward the crater, carefully rifles up, scanning the undergrowth. He steadied his breathing, aimed for the lead man's chest, and squeezed. The soldier crumpled. The second dove behind a stump. 2 rounds left. George heard shouting behind him, another group flanking from the south, another from the east. They were converging like wolves. He knew the truth instantly. He couldn't win this fight, not against men armed with faster rifles layered in numbers, tightening the noose. His bolt action had limits. Limits he'd pushed for 3 days. Limits that now demanded a choice: stay and die, or move and live. George ran. He sprinted through vines and roots and branches that clawed at his uniform like the jungle wanted him for itself. His boots slipped on mud. Twigs snapped underfoot. Bullets hissed past his ears. One round took a leaf off a branch inches from his temple. Another hit a tree trunk with a crack so loud he felt it in his teeth. He didn't stop. Not for 90 seconds. Not until his lungs burned and his legs felt carved from lead. Then he dropped into another crater, dry this time, and flattened himself against the earth. The world blurred with the sound of his own heartbeat, the taste of sweat and gun oil heavy on his tongue. He waited, listened. Nothing. The soldiers had not pursued. They stopped at the bodies. Maybe they believed the sniper had fled farther. Maybe they feared the terrain ahead. Maybe they thought the American would bleed out somewhere in the maze of roots and shadows. George checked his Winchester. The stock was caked with mud. Water dripped from the scope. The action felt gritty. He had 2 rounds left. He exhaled slowly, wiped the mud from his hands, and began moving northeast toward the American lines. The jungle was quiet again. Not peaceful. Just quiet in the way a battlefield becomes quiet when violence has already claimed its share. At 11:13, he reached the perimeter. A Marine sentry spotted him, rifle, raised voice sharp with suspicion, until George gave his name, rank and unit. The Marine blinked at the mud-caked, blood-streaked figure with the battered Winchester and silently waved him through. George walked straight to Captain Morris. "Report," the captain said. George stood tall, rainwater dripping from his uniform. 11 snipers, he said quietly. 11 confirmed. 3 days. He hesitated, then added, "And 3 more in infantry pursuit." The captain stared at him stunned, then nodded slowly, reverently. The nightmare of Point Cruz was over, and the American lines were suddenly safer than they had been in weeks. When George finally stepped back into camp, the mud on his uniform had dried into a second skin. Every muscle ached as though he had aged 10 years in a single morning. Yet the Winchester, scratched, soaked, and caked with grit, was still clutched in his hands like a lifeline. Men turned to look at him as he walked through the perimeter, not with mockery anymore, not with doubt, but with something quiet, heavier, harder to name: respect. Captain Morris didn't say congratulations, didn't say good work. He only said, "Get cleaned up. We'll talk later." A tone that meant, "I don't know how you survived that, but I'm damn glad you did." George returned to his tent and set the Winchester on a crate. He stared at it for a long moment, tracing the patterns of dried mud along the barrel in action. The rifle had done everything he'd ever asked of it. It had kept pace with him through every shot, every bolt cycle, every moment where his life balanced on a trigger pull. Then he sat down and started to clean it. Disassembling the Winchester felt like unpacking the last 72 hours. The grit in the bolt was the machine gun burst he'd narrowly escaped. The mud, in the grooves of the stock, came from the water-filled crater where he'd killed 3 men in less than 20 seconds. The dampness in the barrel was a silent reminder of how close he had come to drowning himself just to stay hidden. He pushed patch after patch through the bore until they came out clean. Each pass steadied his breath. Each click of metal against metal pulled him back into himself. By 1400 hours, a runner arrived at his tent. "The colonel wants to see you." George stood shoulders stiff and followed the runner to battalion headquarters. He expected discipline, maybe even reprimand. He had operated alone, fired more rounds than ordered, taken risks no officer would authorize. And yet when he entered the room, he found not anger, but anticipation. Colonel Ferry, tall and sharp-eyed, studied George with the gaze of a man evaluating a rare tool. Captain Morris stood beside him, arms folded, a faint smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. Ferry asked just one question. "Lieutenant, can you teach other men to do what you've done?" George paused, surprised by the bluntness of the request. "I can teach them to shoot," he answered carefully. "But what happened out there took time and a rifle built for precision." "Not every man has that," Ferry nodded. "We have 14 Marine sniper rifles left behind Springfields, fitted with unertl scopes. And we have 40 men who qualified as expert marksmen before deployment." Then the colonel leaned forward. "You will build a sniper section. You will train them. And you will remove every remaining Japanese sniper operating near American lines." George took a slow breath. There were moments in war where decisions happened without thinking, pure instinct, pure reflex. But this wasn't one of them. This was something different, the realization that his skills were no longer just survival tools. They had become a weapon the Army needed. "I'll do it," he said at last. "But I'm keeping my Winchester." Ferry didn't even hesitate. Approved. And just like that, the rifle that the battalion had once mocked became the standard by which every new sniper would be measured. Training began on January 27th. 40 men, some confident, some skeptical, gathered at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. Most had never fired with optics. None had hunted human beings hiding in banyan canopies. None knew what it felt like to fire a rifle while submerged in waist-deep water, or to hold their breath long enough that their vision trembled. George didn't teach bravado. He taught patience, breathing, wind reading, trigger discipline so refined that a single heartbeat could ruin the shot. The Springfield sniper rifles were heavier than his Winchester 11 pounds with the long unertl scopes. Their optics were powerful but fragile, requiring careful adjustments. George demonstrated how to stabilize the rifles using logs, sandbags, even tree roots, because the jungle rarely offered a clean firing position. Each lesson came with a story, not heroic, not embellished, just painfully real. "How long can you hold a position?" a private asked. "As long as it takes," George said, "or until someone kills you for moving." The range echoed with shots, day after day, clean cracks of precision fire, replacing the sloppy volleys of ordinary infantry practice. Men learned to hit targets at 100 yards, then 300, then 400. Moving targets, concealed targets, targets partially hidden behind branches. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could reliably place shots on man-sized silhouettes at 300 yards under field conditions. That was enough. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, each with a shooter and a spotter. Roles would rotate after each engagement to keep skills sharp and avoid dependency. And then the real test began. On February 1st, George led 4 teams into the field west of the Guadalcanal River. It wasn't snipers they were hunting now, but stragglers, Japanese infantry slipping through the jungle as their evacuation accelerated. At 07:20, the first enemy soldier appeared. Hayes, George's spotter, whispered, "Target confirmed." George fired. A single shot. A clean kill. The day went like that: silent hunts, controlled breathing, perfect calm. 7 shots. 6 kills. 1 missed round carried off by a gust of crosswind. The other teams performed just as well. 23 Japanese soldiers died that day, not in frenzied firefights, not in chaotic ambushes, but with quiet, terrifying precision. This was no longer one man's duel in the groves of Point Cruz. This was the birth of a sniper force, a force that would change the rhythm of the battlefield, and the Japanese would feel it before they ever understood it. For 12 relentless days in early February, Georgia's newly formed sniper section became a silent storm drifting across Guadalcanal, unseen, unheard, but deeply feared. They didn't march in formation or fight in blazing skirmishes. They moved in pairs, gliding through vines and kunai grass, choosing every footstep like it might decide the next minute of their lives. And the numbers told the truth. 4 confirmed, kills each one, observed with eyes, not guessed. 0 American casualties. Every team returned from each operation intact. Not because they had better rifles, though the Springfields were excellent, but because George had taught them something no manual ever captured. A sniper doesn't just fire a rifle. A sniper reads a battlefield, the way a priest reads scripture, slowly, reverently searching for what others overlook. But even precision can't stop a war from shifting. By February 7th, American intelligence confirmed what everyone suspected the Japanese were pulling out. Destroyers slipped in under moonless skies, rescuing what remained of their shattered regiments. The Americans pushed west, hoping to choke off the escape, and where resistance stiffened Georgia's teams, went in first. It was during one of those actions near the Tanambogo River that the war finally reached back and touched George. He and Hayes had moved into a small rise overlooking a narrow jungle trail. Moisture dripped from every leaf, and the air tasted like metal from distant artillery. They spotted a small Japanese squad moving cautiously through the mud, and George lifted his rifle, not for a perfect shot, but a necessary one. He never got the chance. The bullet struck him before he heard the rifle. A whip crack, a burst of heat, then pain that stole his breath. The round punched through his left shoulder, spinning him violently to the ground. His rifle slammed into the dirt beside him. For one nauseating moment, he couldn't move his arm, couldn't tell if bone was shattered or muscles simply refused to listen. The world blurred, trees tilted. Hayes grabbed him by the collar, dragging him behind a boulder as more shots tore through the air. "Stay with me," Lieutenant Hayes shouted. George tried to answer, but only a raw gasp came out. Blood soaked through his uniform, dripping down his ribs in a warm wave. It took 10 minutes for medics to reach them, 10 minutes filled with sporadic rifle fire, and the nauseating clarity that he who had survived 11 snipers, mortars, machine guns, and jungle predators might die here on a muddy riverbank because he was 1 second too slow. But fate blinked. Or luck. Or something else. The bullet had missed every major vessel and bone, passing clean through muscle. The pain was savage, but the wound was survivable. George was evacuated to the field hospital near Henderson Field, where white canvas tents glowed under the tropical sun, like ghosts among the palms. For 2 weeks he lay in a cot watching the war from a distance, a strange punishment for a man who had spent every waking hour stalking it. Nurses cleaned the wound, changed bandages, checked for infection. The doctors told him no combat for at least 3 weeks. But war doesn't wait for a man's shoulder to heal. On February 9th, American troops reached Cape Esperance and found only empty sand. The Japanese had finished their evacuation. Guadalcanal, this brutal, disease-ridden, jungle-choked battleground, was finally, officially theirs. The campaign was over. Georgia's sniper section faded immediately into military reports. 74 confirmed kills. 0 casualties. Operationally significant. Colonel Ferry recommended him for a Bronze Star. Men he had trained visited the hospital bringing stories, jokes, even stolen rations. Hayes brought him his Winchester cleaned and oiled, as if returning a knight's sword. But war is a wheel, and George's role was about to turn again. While he recovered, orders arrived from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced officers for a new mission. Something secret. Something in Burma. Something that required the kind of man who could survive mud fear and ghosts in the trees. George didn't hesitate. He volunteered. By March, he was aboard a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester lay packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold, the same rifle that had saved his life more times than he could count. He didn't know the details, only that this mission involved long-range patrols, deep jungle infiltration, and operations behind enemy lines. The kind of mission built for someone who had already lived inside the shadows of another jungle. The ship reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed. They were joining a new experimental unit, 3,000 men with no official name, yet trained to fight like phantoms in terrain others considered impossible. The men called themselves something else, Merrill's Marauders. And George the sniper, who hunted 11 ghosts in the banyan trees, was about to step into a new nightmare. One even more unforgiving than Guadalcanal. India hit George like a wall of heat and dust the moment he stepped off the transport ship. This wasn't the wet, suffocating green of Guadalcanal. This was a vast land pulsing with life markets, echoing with unfamiliar languages, the smell of curry drifting through camp, the distant rumble of monsoon clouds gathering over the plains. It was beautiful and deceptive. The real battlefield lay east beyond the jungles of Assam, through the mountains inside Burma, into terrain so unforgiving that British commanders once compared it to marching through the mouth of hell. George's introduction to Merrill's Marauders was simple. 3,000 men, no heavy artillery, no vehicles, no supply lines, only what they carried on their backs and what they could steal from the jungle. Their mission was insane. By any conventional standard, advance deep into northern Burma, cut Japanese supply routes, outmaneuver entire divisions, and seize the airfield at Myitkyina, an airfield the Japanese believed no American force could ever reach on foot. George wasn't joining as a sniper, not officially. The Army still didn't recognize snipers as a formal role. He was listed as a rifle platoon leader. But combat whispers follow a man, and George's reputation had crossed the ocean before he did. Officers sought him out curious. Enlisted men studied him. Some approached him with their rifles, asking quietly if he could check their sights. They weren't looking at a lieutenant. They were looking at a man who had done the impossible. Training took place in the heat-blasted jungles of central India. The Marauders learned to live with leeches, to march 30 miles on a cup of rice, to sleep standing against trees when rain turned the ground into rivers. George adapted quickly. Guadalcanal had carved him into a creature who understood mud, silence, and patience. Burma would demand all of those things and something more: endurance. The real challenge was weight. Every ounce counted. The Winchester had been perfect for Point Cruz, but Burma was a place where a pound of steel could cost a man a mile of endurance. So George modified his rifle again. He removed the Lyman Alaskan scope and replaced it with a lighter Weaver 330. Swapped out the wooden stock for a synthetic one. Trimmed weight where he could, knowing that a single ounce saved on a weapon meant another ounce of food or water carried into the jungle. After the adjustments, the rifle dropped to just under 9 pounds. It still felt like home in his hands. By late February 1944, the Marauders moved out into the mountains, into the choking undergrowth, into a world where trails dissolved into mud and cliffs sliced downward like broken teeth. The Japanese believed the terrain was impassable for an army. They weren't entirely wrong. The march broke men. It killed pack mules. It drove some soldiers into hallucinations from starvation and fever. But George kept moving. And 3 times during the nightmare march, he used his Winchester. Once at 412 yards to end the life of a Japanese officer directing fire across a river. Once at 380 yards to neutralize a machine gun crew that had pinned an entire platoon. Once at 290 yards to kill a sniper who had pinned down a Marauder patrol for 40 minutes. 3 shots, 3 kills, no follow-up rounds. Shoot, move, disappear again. But something became clear during those 3 months. Burma wasn't a sniper's war. The jungle was too dense, the sightlines too short. Most engagements happened at distances where you could smell the other man's sweat. George often fought at 20 feet instead of 200 yards. His Winchester wasn't useless, it simply belonged to another kind of battlefield, one that now lived only in his memories. By May, after 3 months and more than 700 miles, the marauders reached Miatkina. They took the airfield in one of the most miraculous and devastating operations of the war. It was a victory, but at catastrophic cost. Disease ravaged the unit. Malaria, dysentery, typhus. Of the original 3,000 marauders, fewer than 1,300 remained fit for duty. Of those, many could barely stand. The unit was disbanded shortly after. George survived. And so did the Winchester. When he returned to the United States in July 1944, he carried the rifle into Fort Benning as quietly as he had carried it through the jungle. There, he was promoted to captain and tasked with teaching young officers the lessons he had learned the hard way: how to shoot, how to move, how to survive alone. He taught them about patience, wine concealment, and silence. He taught them that a soldier's greatest weapon wasn't a rifle. It was calm. But something changed in him. The war was shifting toward mechanized power, mass-produced rifles, identical training, standardized everything. The age of individual craftsmanship on the battlefield was fading, and George knew it. After the war, his life became almost scholarly. Princeton, Oxford, research in East Africa, lecturing at the State Department. He became a man known for intellect, diplomacy, analysis, never for the silent jungles of Guadalcanal. He almost never spoke of it. But in 1947, alone with his memories, he began writing just to record the details of combat before time could wash them away. 6 months later, he had a 400-page manuscript. A friend convinced him to publish it. Shots fired in anger. It became an underground classic among marksmen historians and soldiers who understood that courage was not noise. It was precision, patience, and survival in impossible places. John George lived long enough to watch 3 more wars rise and fall. He watched the evolution of rifles from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal discipline, finally recognized as essential to modern warfare. He died in 2009 at 90 years old. Today, the Winchester Model 70, the same rifle that outshot 11 Japanese snipers in a nightmare jungle, sits in a glass case at the National Firearms Museum. Most visitors walk past without noticing it. But you know better. That rifle wasn't just wood and steel. It was resolve. It was defiance. It was the quiet heartbeat of a man who refused to die in the dark. A rifle that shaped a soldier. A soldier who shaped a story. A story that refuses to fade. In the end, what stays with me most about John George isn't the number of shots he fired or the impossible odds he survived. It's the stillness. The quiet courage of a man alone in a jungle, choosing patience over panic, precision over chaos. His story reminds us that history isn't just shaped by armies and generals, but by individuals, ordinary men, who find extraordinary strength when the world demands it. And maybe that's why we tell these stories. Not to glorify war, but to remember the humans inside it. If you felt something in this journey, if this story stayed with you even for a moment, consider subscribing to WW2 Secrets. It helps us keep these forgotten voices alive. And I'd be honored to share the next story with you.